Good evening and welcome to the Gospel Truth. I'm Brother Alan Jackson, bringing to you spiritual songs and hymns and the power of the spoken word of God. First of all, giving thanks to God Almighty for blessing me with this another opportunity yet beyond this the time side of life, and to have this another blessed privilege to come to you in His name by way of this television medium, and to bring to you another message from His holy and divine word. And as I always do, I'd like to continue to express my appreciation and my gratitude to the production staff for their diligent service to the gospel truth. It's my prayer that God will continue to bless each one of them with those things that He knows that they are standing in need of. And I'm praying on your behalf as participant observers. And it's my prayer that God will continue to bless you and your family members with those things that He knows that you are standing in need of as well. And then, of course, I'm encouraging you to pray on my behalf because I'm also standing in need of prayer. And it's only God who can provide me with those things that I am standing in need of. And here it is February, and once again, the Gospel Truth will pay tribute to Black American history. This year, 2017, with the changing of the White House guard and the rhetoric of Make America Great Again, I believe that it is necessary for us as a people to reflect back over our history in an effort to reignite our quest for justice and equality. It has been said that if you don't know your history, you are bound to repeat it. This week and next week, I'm bringing you a glimpse of history and my experience as a Black American here in America. Hopefully, it will stimulate your motivation and enable you to get busy working and organizing efforts to make us as God's people greater than before. Please bring your children in and have them to see what it took for us as Black people to get to where we are today. Now, in view of our current administration, we must be vigilant, prepared, and ready. And so now, America in the 20th century, the Civil Rights Movement.
In the middle of the 20th century, oppression and racism were challenged by courage.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
Leadership.
Negroes want complete equality, social, economic, and political.
And a dream.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
A crusade that galvanized a people. It unfolded in the courts and exploded on the streets. The demand for freedom and equality promised to unite the nation and threatened to tear it apart. It was the long, dramatic struggle of the Civil Rights Movement. In all of America's history, no war has been as divisive, as bitterly fought, or as costly as the American Civil War. The question of slavery, above all others, defined the conflict between the Union North and Confederate South. Through 4 long years, men fought and died to determine the future of slavery and the fate of the Union itself. President Lincoln declared that on New Year's Day, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any rebellious state shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it marked a turning point in the war. Thereafter, every advance was a step toward Union victory and freedom for all who were enslaved. That victory came on April 9th, 1865, when Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. The man who had fought so passionately to preserve the Union would not live to help bind up its wounds. That task would prove to be nearly insurmountable. The Civil War had ravaged the South. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were literally reduced to rubble. And while buildings and bridges would rise again, the ideas and institutions of the Old South would not. The last will and testament of a Confederate officer named John Sargent Wise exposed the anxiety that plagued many Southerners.
And now, having experienced a death to Confederate ideas and a new birth unto allegiance to the Union, I depart. I see what has been pulled down very clearly. What is to be built up in its place, I know not. It is a mystery.
What had been pulled down was a way of life, built on the bondage and exploitation of others. But following Union victory, during what is known as the Reconstruction era, 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution extended to former slaves the blessings of liberty: freedom, citizenship, the right to due process and equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens feared that laws alone would be inadequate.
The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. If we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better have left them in bondage.
The concern was prescient. For die-hard Confederates, Reconstruction and racial integration were bitter pills. Through intimidation and terror, they sought to redeem what had been lost on the battlefield. Seething resentment toward Northern invaders fueled the growth of vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan or KKK. Clad in white robes and bearing torches, Klan posses terrorized the South. One former slave recalled a Klan lynching.
I never will forget when they hung Cy Guy. They comed after him 100 strong. They ties him there in the woods, and with that blood they writes that he shall hang between the heavens and the earth till he is dead, dead, dead. Well, sir, the next morning there he hung, swinging in the wind.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part,
Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
"The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done."
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction to overcome. In 1917, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson committed the nation to World War I in order that the world might be made safe for democracy. 400,000 black Americans would serve during the war, fighting abroad for freedoms they were denied at home, dying for a country where discrimination was widespread, where Southern Jim Crow laws relegated them to attend inferior schools, to drink from separate fountains, ride in separate streetcars, and where poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation prevented the vast majority of blacks from exercising their right to vote. Many Negroes fled the South during the period to find work in the factories and shipyards of the North. They found better jobs, higher wages, a brighter future, and in many areas, venomous racism. Competition for jobs between blacks and whites led to violence in many cities. Newspapers christened the summer of 1919 the Red Summer of Hate, for the national frenzy of race riots and lynchings that gripped the country. Discrimination was endemic in the U.S. military as well. One young Army officer named Charles Hamilton Houston later recalled his experience during World War I.
The hate and scorn showered on us Negro officers by our fellow Americans convinced me there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them. I made up my mind that if I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back.
Houston lived, and, true to his word, took up the fight for social justice. He accepted a position as legal counsel for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1934, and joined the battle to overthrow the Southern system of segregation. Founded in 1909, the NAACP was a tireless crusader against racial violence. It focused on a legal approach to ending discrimination, fighting in the nation's courtrooms rather than in the streets. In 1919, the organization waged a high-profile campaign against the racist motion picture, The Birth of a Nation. The film's director, D.W. Griffith, portrayed Southern whites as the victims of lascivious blacks and carpetbagging Northerners. Klansmen were cast as valiant heroes. The NAACP criticized the melodrama as 3 miles of filth, but to no avail. It was fabulously popular and shaped a romanticized yet widely accepted view of the Reconstruction South that persisted for decades. Taking a cue from Birth of a Nation, Charles Houston and his team harnessed the power of the motion picture to document the disparity between black and white education in South Carolina. The visual record they compiled anchored a new 3-step legal strategy to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Demonstrate that separate educational facilities were seldom equal. Make equality too expensive for states to maintain. Finally, attack the very principle of separate but equal. Under the guidance of Houston, the NAACP legal team filed case after case, slowly chipping away at the legal foundation of segregation. At the same time, the current of social progress was eroding the racial caste system. In 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. The next year, President Harry S. Truman issued executive orders to end segregation in both the federal workforce and the military.
But we cannot any longer await the growth of a will to action in the slowest state or the most backward community. Our national government must show the way.
Truman's public support for civil rights prompted a fierce backlash from Southern Democrats.
These uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights.
As the NAACP prepared for its final assault on school segregation, Southern segregationists dug in and prepared for battle.
Paraphrasing the language of the great commoner of a generation ago, you shall not crucify the South on this cross of civil rights.
We may not win today or tomorrow, Charles Houston wrote in 1947, but the storm gathers, and all the pride and power of prejudice will be swept away. Houston did not live to see legal segregation abolished, but the fight continued following his death in 1950. In fact, it was time to test the final phase of his strategy. It was time to put the concept of separate on trial. The NAACP filed suit on behalf of the Reverend Oliver Brown and a dozen other families living in Topeka, Kansas. Brown's daughter, Linda, was forced to walk 21 blocks to the nearest black school, while there was a comparable white school only 7 blocks away. Their case was consolidated with 4 other cases of school segregation and came before the United States Supreme Court bearing one name: Oliver Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. On behalf of the plaintiffs, Thurgood Marshall argued that it was not enough to have equal public schools. He produced evidence that suggested segregation itself branded black children with a stamp of inferiority that affected their ability to learn. For the defendants, attorney John W. Davis based his argument on the 1896 precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson. He asserted that Negroes should not throw away the equality that existed between black and white schools simply to achieve prestige. For 17 months, the nation waited. Finally, on May 17, 1954, the court handed down its opinion. Before a hushed courtroom, Chief Justice Earl Warren read the unanimous decision.
In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
The news resounded in every quarter of American society. The Negro-owned Chicago Defender newspaper wrote,
"Neither the atom bomb nor the hydrogen bomb will ever be as meaningful to our democracy as the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court."
Few Southerners welcomed the Brown decision. The most venomous critics predicted a new racial war.
Human blood may stain Southern soil, but the dark red stains of that blood will be on the marble steps of the United States Supreme Court building.
The progressive newspaperman, Harding Carter Jr., thought differently.
For 75 years, we sent Negro kids to school in hovels and pig pens. We must replace trickery and subterfuge with an honest realization that every American child has the right to an equal education.
The initial Brown decision did not mandate immediate desegregation, but a year later, in a group of cases known collectively as Brown 2, the Supreme Court urged that school districts make a prompt and reasonable start toward full compliance, and that Negroes be admitted to previously all-white public schools with all deliberate speed. The court had spoken, and many school districts willingly complied with its decision. But other Southerners, including some at the highest level of government, remained defiant. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond drafted an official battle cry for states' rights, known as the Southern Manifesto. over 100 members of Congress pledged their support for the document, which called on all Southerners to resist integration by any lawful means. Americans looked to President Eisenhower for moral leadership and to unite the country on the issue of civil rights. But the president did not favor the sweeping changes mandated by Brown.
If you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake. I believe we've got to have laws that go along with education and understanding. And I believe if you go beyond that at any one time, you cause trouble rather than benefit.
Off the record, the president went further. He called his appointment of Chief Justice Warren the biggest damn fool thing I ever did. Eisenhower's feeble public support for civil rights encouraged some Southerners to openly challenge court-ordered desegregation. Following the Brown decision, the Little Rock, Arkansas School Board developed a plan to integrate its public schools. 9 Negro students, who would become known as the Little Rock Nine, were scheduled to begin the 1957 school year at the previously all-white Little Rock Central High. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had publicly supported integration, but at the last minute, he changed his position.
I have therefore, in accordance with the solemn responsibilities and the oath of my office, taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
The campus was swarming with segregationist protesters on the first day of school. National Guardsmen were drawn up in formation to prevent any Negro students from entering the building. Elizabeth Eckford later recalled her terrifying experience.
Somebody started yelling, "Lynch her, lynch her." I tried to see a friendly face. I looked into the face of an old woman and it seemed like a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me.
Every day for the next 3 weeks, hundreds of sign-toting protesters stood vigil at the high school. But if these elements represented the entrenched prejudice of the past, some of Central High's white students symbolized hope for the future.
Well, now, what about this? Do you think that the trouble is with the students here in the high school and in the schools of Little Rock, or is it with the parents, or is it with outsiders, or where is the trouble?
I think it's the parents.
What do you think?
Well, I think it was just downright un-American. I think it was the most terrible thing that has ever been seen in America. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm sounding patriotic or something like that, but I always thought that all men were created equal.
Despite public cries for his intervention, President Eisenhower maintained that Little Rock's problems should be settled in the courts. Privately, he feared he would be forced to act. "If I do," he told an aide, "you can bet one thing. It will be quick, hard, and decisive." The issue was no longer segregation versus integration. It was a question of the supremacy of the United States government. Governor Faubus finally agreed to remove the National Guard troops. But that only fueled the violence. White mobs attacked members of the Negro Press Corps. One reporter, Alex Wilson of the Tri-State Defender, was brutally beaten and never recovered from his injuries. After weeks of patience, President Eisenhower was left with only one choice.
Certain misguided persons, many of them imported into Little Rock by agitators, have insisted upon defying the law and have sought to bring it into disrepute. The orders of the court have thus been frustrated.
The president federalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered 1,200 Army paratroopers into Little Rock. He made it clear that he was legally compelled to uphold the Supreme Court's directive.
The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command. Thus will be restored the image of America and of all its parts as one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Federal troops brought an abrupt end to the dissent, which had festered for nearly a month. With order restored, they escorted the Negro students to school. The crisis in Little Rock graphically underscored the hardening resolve of Jim Crow segregationists.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
As the civil rights movement swept across the South, placed names like Birmingham, Neshoba County, and Selma would make Little Rock look like a beginner's course in racial violence.
I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice.
When abolitionist Theodore Parker wrote these words in 1853, he did so with a vision for the nation that few then held. 1 century later, the Brown decision seemed to vindicate his dream. It marked the beginning of the end for de jure segregation, segregation by law. But the practice of segregation, de facto segregation, continued, and challenging this Southern dogma could be lethal. In 1955, a 14-year-old Chicago boy named Emmett Till traveled to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. A month later, his body returned home in a pine box. For the high crime of whistling at a white woman, Emmett Till had been beaten and shot, and his body dumped in the Tallahatchie River. The legal system had been too slow, the arc too long to save Emmett Till and countless other victims of racial violence.